My oldest is at sleepaway camp, and my younger two are at their grandparents' Shabbat. So the house is very quiet. Maybe it just shows you how much sleep I need to catch up on. Yeah. So.
What sleepaway camp did you send it to?
My oldest is going to a sleepaway camp in New Hampshire. It's called Camp Yavna, which is a Jewish camp. Yeah. She went there for the very unoriginal reason that that's where all of her friends were going. She had never been to sleepaway camp before. She's going into 8th grade. All of her friends have been going to this camp. They said she's like, I want to go to sleepaway camp and I want to go with my friends. I suppose I don't know where we would have, but it seems like she's having a great time. Okay. I've only gotten one letter, which is usually a sign that she's having a great time. If she were having a terrible time, I would have heard by now.
She's not homesick. She's not. Okay.
She's only had time to write her mom and my wife and me each one letter. I feel like I feel like that's a good sign, not a bad sign. You know what I mean?
It's great.
I was at camp for many years. Camp Westmont in Pennsylvania.
Camp what?
Camp Westmont.
Oh, okay.
It's in Pennsylvania. Still around to this day.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah. Because I was on their Instagram page this morning.
Oh, okay. Actually, there was I don't know, did you all see about the floods that happened? That was really sad. That's really scary.
Yeah.
Well, there were floods in Texas, and apparently an entire summer camp got flooded.
Oh, wow.
Called Camp Mystic, which is like a Christian summer camp. I don't want them to suffer. I don't want anyone there to suffer either. But apparently, like 30 kids are missing. It's really scary. And just apparently, like the flood just like washed the whole thing away.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I know anybody from that camp, but that doesn't mean I'm not like super sad about it. There's only one Jewish camp in Texas that I'm aware of. One like overnight camp. So I thought I would pick a really interesting interpretation of this week's Torah portion to sort of like put us in the mind of someone who, might be a little bit different than us. Like, most people who come to our synagogue, I think have really strong feelings about their Judaism, but I wouldn't necessarily say that every single second of every single day, that's all they're focusing on. Or if they ever find themselves like, focusing on something that's not Judaism, that they feel like they're doing something wrong about that. Like I turned on before Shabbat started the Orioles Atlanta Braves game last night. And so I went into Shabbat with no children, like relaxing to the Orioles playing the Atlanta Braves. I suppose I'm not really thinking that much about Judaism while I'm doing that. And I'm the rabbi. I would say that I think about Judaism a pretty high amount of my day, like maybe 75, 80%, but there's still like 20% of it. So, it's interesting to put ourselves in the mind of someone who like, this is all they think about. And if they ever think about anything else, they are going to decide that that's like something wrong they need to like correct. So there's this interpretation of a ritual from this week's Torah portion. It's called the red heifer. Anyone know what the red heifer is? Okay, what is the red heifer?
I don't know, but I've heard of something, but I don't know what it is.
All right, well, first of all, what is a heifer?
Cow.
A heifer is a cow. So let's start off with that. And why? And what is the red part of the red heifer? It's actually like a cow that is entirely red.
Wow.
Like it's an actual red. Now, you've probably not seen many red cows in your life, so it's pretty It's pretty rare, but there's this ritual that when you come into contact with a dead body, you are supposed to. There's a purification process goes on, and you also have to use the sacrifice of this, of what is in Hebrew we call it the para aduma. It's almost like blood red, by the way, because aduma, which is like adom is red, but like dam is the word for blood, so it's almost like a blood red cow. You have to use. Explain the hand motion you made about the sprinkling.
Yeah, it's a sprinkling out. So basically, the red cow gets burned up. There's a bunch of ashes, and then the priest will sprinkle the ashes on anyone who has come in contact with the dead, because at that point you're kind of defiled and unholy. And this process of the red heifer ashes now essentially cleanses you.
Yeah, so I mean, it's not a for a biblical ritual, it's not, in some sense, it's like not that strange. I mean, there are other biblical rituals like that, but this one involves this red cow, which is kind of why it stands out. Keep in mind, these people are in the middle of the desert, so like where exactly they're supposed to find a red cow every time this happens is like a really like open question. It's not like you can just like go to any field of cows and find a red cow. So that in of itself, it's like it's a very hard thing to imagine, especially because.
Do they still do this day? They still do the ritual to this day?
No, I mean it's like it's in that category of like sacrificial rituals that there's no temple, so there's no red heifer, that we do, but it's it's no different than any other mitzvah in the Torah. It's just, it's the idea of like saying like, let's find a red cow every time there's this contact with a dead body is like a hard thing to imagine, especially given that most of us have never seen a red cow before. So,
and I always wondered, like back in the day, right? There were a lot of wars, a lot of dead bodies. There was probably a lot of people who had to be in contact with a dead body more so than in our current society. Like didn't they run out of the ashes at some point? Like that's what I was thinking. Like how many ash? Like how much ash did you get from one cow, and then how much did you have to sprinkle on each person to purify them? And like do the math as far as like people dying either natural causes or by war. Or disease, right? And then someone having to be in contact with a dead body. Like I was just thinking from a numbers perspective. Like how did they?
Well, you've identified something that is an interesting contrast between this is where the historical record of the Bible and what the Bible says to do become a little bit at odds with each other, because like you could argue the same thing, by the way, about sacrifices in general. It's like how many animals did people have around such that they could basically kill one of them to be used for a purpose that's not related to their own sustenance.
Well, I remember in Hebrew school, the rabbi, the teacher ordered chicken, and he was supposed to sometime around your head, I think.
Yes. Yeah, but people actually do that ritual. I have never done it in my life. There are places in Israel where you can do the chickens, the swinging. In Yiddish, it's called Sierra. Is like our eyes are like widened about this idea. It is a real thing. Sierra's like, are you sure? I mean, am I sure I want to like become Jewish tomorrow? In Yiddish they call it shlugan kaparas, which shlugan in Yiddish means like to swing.
Yeah.
And it's basically this idea that like you're taking a chicken and you're swinging it over your head, and you do this before Yom Kippur, and it basically is sort of like a symbolic kind of like sending away of your sins, more or less. You're like swinging them like away like a slingshot almost.
you let go of the chicken?
No,
No,
no, you're not supposed to let go of the chicken.
What happens to the bird
then I guess
after?
it's
He's
No, the chicken is no longer alive unless I've never done this before. I've never had much desire to do chicken kaparis, but it is a thing. But you think about sacrifices. These are animals that produce meat. Some of them produce natural substances like milk. So the idea, like how many cows are random people going to have in the desert such that they can like bring one to the Mishkan or to the temple and like have it slaughtered so that they no longer have it. Like it's a very valuable thing to be like giving up. So one of the questions historians have with the numbers in the Bible versus the reality is like, how realistic was it for a person to actually do all of these things? And that question is going to have to be left unanswered, because if you really were to follow it to the letter, it's funny. It would be realistic to do it today. It wouldn't necessarily be realistic to do it back then, because we manufacture animals at such a horrifyingly large rate. But it wouldn't be as hard to like produce the number of cows that you needed. But a couple thousand years ago, probably would have been hard to do that. But so there's a midrash on this text that says, it says elsewhere in Scripture, in reference to the oral law, neither is it found in the land of the living. What is the meaning of the verse, neither is it found in the land of the living? Does it mean that the oral law is only found among the deceased? Indeed, not. It means that the oral law is not found among those who pursue the pleasures of this world, its passions, its glories, its greatness, but only among those who deprive themselves for its sake. As it is said, this is the law, when a man dieth in a tent. That's the verse above. Okay, so let's just kind of unpack what we think the oral law, which is really like all the rules of Judaism, right, is not found among those who pursue the pleasures of this world. What do we think that means?
Yeah, I mean, how are you going to hear it if you're not around? I think that maybe you have to be around a community of people who share in this like daily practice, or it's like constant practice, I guess. If you're like not doing it with them, then you're not likely to overhear it or participate the same way as somebody who's doing it every day.
Mm-hmm.
As the people who are not pursuing those pleasures of the world.
Well, but don't forget, this is done with dead people. This is done with someone that's dead, that they put the ashes on. Am I correct about that?
Well, but don't worry about the ritual for the moment. Like, this is how they're interpreting. They're like, in a midrash, in an explanation on it. Oftentimes, that explanation will go far, far away from what the original text is about. So somehow, the rabbis who wrote this interpreted this text about the red heifer to be saying, like, that what they choose to focus on is this idea that like a person can't follow, the Jewish law through pleasure, but only through depriving themselves of something. I think our synagogue may have finally grown back enough that we can afford to have a guard at the door on Shabbat, which both for security reasons and for practical reasons, I think could be incredibly valuable, because it means we won't have to do this whole like letting people in thing. I always worry that there are like people who feel weird like ringing a doorbell, and they want to come over the first time, and they don't want to ring the doorbell, so they just like go away and we never see them again. Hi, Aaron. It's either that or keep the door wide open, which is not like, yeah. But, the synagogue has grown quite a lot. And so I feel like we would have, the synagogue really should have enough money to be able to have a guard at the door when we are for Saturday mornings, or for when we have Shabbat services and when we have Hebrew school at this point. And then we don't have to worry about the bell at all, except when those not things. I digress. That's a project for the summer. As you can see, Aaron, we're small today, so we're going extra casual.
Right.
Who knows? Maybe we'll.
I did a good job.
What?
I did a great job.
Yes, you did.
I prepared pretty well.
Yes, we are 5/6. If we were having services next week, then Sierra would count in Armenian. Her last day not counting in Armenian. Don't mean to single you out. I'm personally super excited. I've already prepared your certificates. Okay, so I'm all ready. But let's talk about the basic premise here is it's saying, all right, a person cannot find Jewish law through pleasure, but only through depriving themselves. It's like, before we think about how we feel about this, let's first make sure we understand what it means.
I guess you tie it back to, the whole concept of not letting your eyes or your heart lead you astray, right? The idea is not to let the material world kind of dictate your life, but to prioritize maybe the spiritual world. Like that is maybe what it's kind of hinting at.
Okay, so you used two different things there. One was like don't let your eyes go astray, and then you mentioned like the spiritual world. So going back to my example here, right? Like using myself as an example. How much of a percentage every day am I thinking about my Judaism? And this is the rabbi talking. I would probably put it at like 75, 80% of the day. But it's not 100%. It's not 100% of the day, for me at least. I do enjoy other things in the world that are not primarily like Jewish observance related things. According to this text, have I violated this principle of the way that the ideal this text is describing? Am I in violation of it?
I would say yeah.
Yeah, I would say yes too. I would say that 75 to 80% is not good enough, right? In the eyes of what this text is saying.
And go back to the Shema, right? If you look at the Shema, it says to love God with all your heart and soul. And you take that means like 100% of the time, like which I always wondered, like, how is that possible? How is it possible that a person could just have God on their mind 100% of the day? It's like almost an impossible task.
No. I don't think so. I mean, the Orthodox do it, the white.
Do they?
Yeah.
You think they do it 100% of the time?
I mean,
I don't think so.
I mean, they have the Orthodox still involved with people that live in Grand Heights.
I know who they are. The same. Think about it. 100% of your waking time for your entire life, from the time that you're right? Before that, it doesn't count, right? So from 13 on up, like that's.
So I think you're both saying something similar without realizing it. Like, so 100% of the time is like a very hard standard for anyone to meet. However, you know, if you were to spend time with someone in a Hasidic community and you were to look at like the books on their shelves or the toys that their children are playing with, or ask them like what their hobbies are, you probably would, in many cases, not, would get a pretty high percentage of all that being somehow like Jewish in nature. Like, there are like if you've ever been to like a Jewish bookstore, like in a really religious neighborhood, there are like board games that look like board games you could get in a toy store, except the board games are like, or they're Hebrew, or they're like Jewishly focused. Like I don't know if anyone ever in their life played like Chutes and Ladders.
Yeah.
Okay, so like there's an equivalent board game of this that's called Mitzvos and Averos, or Mitzvot and Averot, which is
did that one time in Hebrew school. You're actually reminding me. We must have taken a game of regular Chutes and Ladders and turned it into a situation where every time you did a mitzvah, you went up the ladder, and every time you did a bad deed, there was a shoot. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff like that, or like, a lot of religions have these types of things. Like I can imagine like a board game that's the story of Exodus, and like your goal is to get all of the Israelites out of Egypt before a certain, and like every time you roll the die, the Pharaoh comes closer. Like it's like every.
Now look, there, you can be pretty religiously observant. I would put myself in this category, or lots of people, and still do other things, right? Like I was at the Yankee game, or the Orioles at the Yankees, like 2 weeks ago with two of my kids, because I'm an Orioles fan. And, Yankee Stadium has like at least 3 or 4 like kosher stands. You can buy like kosher ballpark food at a Yankee Stadium. I imagine you also can do that at Citi Field. I haven't been there. I haven't been there in a little while, but I'm sure you can do that there. Right? They wouldn't do that if there weren't like, enough religious people going to the baseball game. Now in Baltimore, there's one kosher stand. We have a pretty big religious population. There's only one. Yankee Stadium has like 4 or 5 of them. So it's got to be a pretty decent amount of people who are not going to eat any of this other food at the ballpark going to a baseball game who want to eat it. But there are communities where like that is kind of like, where that's more normal. But setting aside like, everything should be Jewish. This isn't only talking about like you should do Judaism and nothing else. Like how could you argue that like a person who's very religious is still pursuing pleasure in a way that this text would find problematic?
Yeah, like you're not suffering. There's no like you have to abstain. Seems like a gist of this one.
Yeah, like you could have very elaborate meals, right? Like they could be totally kosher, but they could be really, decadent meals with lots of fancy food. I'm not really sure if this text would.
But is there does the ultra Orthodox have? I don't think they have social media, or do they?
I mean, it depends on what community you're talking about.
I the book coverage.
Some.
But the point I'm raising is like, let's forget about like the things that like someone in that community might do that might do or not do that the rest of us would do. I'm talking about like even if you're someone in that community, there might be other ways to violate this. There are, most people have to work somehow to make a living. There are people in those communities who start businesses and actually do quite well for themselves, and like they make a decent amount of money. Would this text say that that's is the person living up to the message in this text with this?
Yeah.
So the idea of like no pleasure at all is a very strange thing to think about.
It's kind of opposite. I mean, I know you've mentioned it in the past. I know in Musar, they talk about it a lot, and that is really always about balance. If Judaism is really supposed to be about balance. It's not supposed to be about like one extreme or the other. And this seems like an extreme, like you have to, to Sierra's point, you have to suffer. Like that's what it's not saying. But in general, my understanding is that we're more about balance.
I mean, look, these things are like interpreted in different. These things are like interpreted in different ways, right? Like so, just before we talk about like what people are doing in the present day, I'm just sort of trying to put ourselves in the shoes of this. Like what, like not so much to say like, all right, you should stop doing anything pleasurable in your life, but that there is this idea of like the word we often use in any religion is what's called asceticism, ASCET, right? Okay, so like there's more of that tradition in Judaism than sometimes we might like to think, and using the Hasidic community as an example, both here and in Israel, as a general rule, that community is quite poor on the whole. Like a significant portion of the Jewish population in New York lives below the poverty line. Not all of them are Hasidic, but when you go into the Hasidic community, that percentage is definitely higher than the average. Part of that reason is people want to. There's a value placed on working the least you have to work, just that you have what you need and nothing else, which you could argue might be basically living at the poverty line. We being non-Hasidic Jews tend to look down on that a little bit, like people don't work, or they're not learning anything in school. That like there's lots of Hasidic schools in New York, but from their perspective, the argument is like, I don't need any of those things. I'm not supposed to be doing any, like all that stuff is sort of at odds with this idea. But what I'm curious about is how might we, without saying we have to like go out tomorrow and never buy a new pair of clothes or do anything fun. Like, what is something that we could take from this value for ourselves and sort of what value is trying to be expressed here that maybe you don't have to take it to the extreme? That's the Musar example I've used before. You don't have to take it to the extreme, but you could at least find the lesson in it that's valuable for you, or me.
I think eliminating the limit of going without is that you can understand. I think you could like heard the text a lot better, because I think what it says excuse me, it says that the following is a path that leads to an understanding of the law. So when you do these things that aren't indulgent, that is when you are getting to the idea of what Hashem wants us to do. So you don't get closer by like indulging all of your human, your like primal brain wants. Like you do it by like going without that, and then that's how you become closer to what like is expected of you.
Yeah, so the deprivation in some way is part of that process of feeling closer. I will confess that I have a really hard time with this in some parts of my life. I like it a lot, and some parts I have a much harder time with it. I just sit up for a minute. only so long you can sit on the cajon. It's not meant to be sat on for a long time. Sam knows what I'm talking about. You know, on the one hand, you know, by becoming a rabbi, one is choosing that the odds of one becoming super rich is very low. It's not like I'm not poor, right? Like I actually probably fall, you know, income-wise in a just fine place in society and very similar to like most of my congregation. But like the odds of my becoming rich are like, by virtue of my rabbinic work, are very, very small. You know, only rabbi I've ever really known who became rich through their rabbinate was like some of the people who like created some of the huge kosher food brands, you know, like Manischewitz or Empire, like, so that might have been an example of that. Or like I knew a rabbi who was he was basically asked to be a technical advisor for the Prince of Egypt. And so basically he gets royalties. He gets royalties for the rest of his life from the Prince of Egypt. Now, obviously they're not as big as like the big royalties, but like it's enough that he can like definitely live like a wealthier life than he would have otherwise been able to do with his chosen rabbinate. So on the one hand, becoming a rabbi means you're depriving yourself of some worldly pleasure. I would have a higher chance of making more money had I done something else. On the other hand, you know, I chose a life of moral ambition, is probably the word I would use. The flip side, though, is that I do things for pleasure. You know, like, you know, I go to the theater and I go to baseball games and go to concerts and watch television that has nothing to do with Judaism. So I'm not really doing this either. And my least favorite thing to do in Jewish observance is fast. I hate fasting.
Oh, I hate you too.
But like fasting is very much in this vein, right? Like fasting is very much in the, to use Sierra's point, like in the deprivation category. You know, the idea that like somehow by going, you know, for somehow my spiritual connection to God is going to be better situated if I spend a day like 25 hours like not eating, not drinking, not, you know, wearing leather or whatever. You know, to me, I've always found this very, very unpleasant, even though, you know, I still do it. So I don't know.
It goes back to what you said, what Sierra said about the deprivation, goes back to what you earlier said about the effort, sacrifice, right? That's what I think God wants from us ultimately, right? He wants to see some level of sacrifice is what he wants to see from us. And sacrifice can come in different forms, but, you know, that's really what it comes down to, right? Whether it's fasting or it's doing something else. Even in some respect, right? Sometimes just being here on Shabbat, right? Right, you're sacrificing something else. Like you know, you could be, you know, out at a picnic, or you could be sleeping in late. But you know, you get up. Sometimes, some days, I know. I can just speaking for myself. I'm exhausted from a long week of, you know, 60, 70-hour week, and I get up and, you know, I come, even though I'm tired, because that's my way of sacrificing something and to show God that I thank him for the gifts that I have.
Yeah. And by the way, you know, there are lots of things that have replaced going to synagogue or church on Saturdays and Sundays in culture. You know, people have actually like researched this. You know, people becoming more into like yoga or Orange Theory or Soul Cycle. Literally, it's called Soul Cycle. is supposed are in some sense like the time that you might have used to have been used to coming here. You're using that to go there. Some people can do both. Okay, Ariel Eckstein is up at 5 a.m. with Orange Theory every day. He still, you know, comes to shul, but The other example I've heard is brunch. Not that brunch hasn't always existed, but like that like in certain places, like brunch is like a really big thing, and like restaurants have like huge lines waiting around the corner for like these big like long brunches, and that time used to in theory might have been spent several decades ago being in church, but instead you're doing something, pleasurable. Now the flip side of it is like, I know clergy in synagogues where, on Saturday after shul's over, people stay for like 4 or 5 hours, like the kids are just playing in the building and no one leaves. Like that seems pretty funny, Same thing like in, in the African American churches that are like near my apartment. Like usually I see people lining up their cars to go into these churches, double parked on the street, at like 10, 11 in the morning, like because I live near Harlem, and the street's usually blocked off for like 5 or 6 hours because like it's not, but church isn't 6 hours. The whole experience is 6 hours, but like the actual church part is like an hour, hour and a half, but like you have a big lunch and everyone brings food and they're just there like for the whole day. That sounds kind of fun to me. It doesn't really sound like you're depriving yourself of anything. It actually sounds kind of fun. I'm saying that in a good way.
I would say my grandma. Well, two things. One, the Outcast video is so fresh and so clean. Like, is this idea like in music video form? But also, I so many times that I've read the Bible have been when my phone died in one of those, and I was just sitting there, and so I just picked it up and started reading because it was just too long. So I gotta do something. So yeah, but I know what you mean. It's just all day.
Yeah, I mean it's not. But the point I'm saying about it is like these are things that like are very time intensive, but I'd assume that people are getting enjoyment out of that. Like there's no reason you have to go to synagogue and stay for 5 hours. In fact, like when I lived in Israel, I lived nearby this. To call it a synagogue is probably not accurate. It was called the Shtibalach. And it was basically like just this house that had a bunch of rooms in it that all were little sanctuaries. And they were just constantly running shul all day long. So on Saturday morning, I could like go to shul at like 6:30 in the morning and be done at like 8 o'clock. And I would usually have lunch plans and I would just go back to sleep for 3 or 4 hours. And the theory behind it is like I did everything I'm supposed to do. Like there's no reason I have to linger. But presumably in places where people do linger, it's because they're enjoying it, it's not because they're depriving themselves of anything. It's actually because they're enjoying it. So those two things sit like oddly with each other in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, two things. The first is when it comes to people worshiping things, I know that in the theater community, fan is actually short for fanatic. So a lot of Broadway shows will develop cult-like followings, and people will become very intensely interested in the show. Whenever it's being produced or made, they'll become very passionately critical or praising of different cast members in different roles. I know that Wicked has a very religious quality. The lead, there are people who seem to know every actor that has played every role and on Broadway and multiple national tours, and seem to have this like encyclopedic knowledge of the show. The second thing is that maybe that there are, to your point about people seeming to get a lot of pleasure out of worship or spiritual practice, even though it may demand asceticism, is that it's a different type of pleasure, the pleasure of having a purpose or of being engaged in a higher purpose, as opposed to like a sensational pleasure. something that pleases the senses is different than the satisfaction of having a purpose, of knowing your place in the world. And so maybe when people talk about, or when in the religious context people talk about letting go of pleasure, it means like sensational pleasure or worldly pleasure, rather than, it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy or find fulfillment in the worship, but it's like a sense. It's not about the senses. It's not about what you see, taste, or touch.
Well, and sensational pleasure that's not just only for your benefit, I suppose, is also a way to add on to that. Like I think Aaron's point is really, it's weird, right? Because some people can find the amount of devotion that people might engage in with any religion to be very, very off-putting. Now, the truth is, on the one hand, you could argue that it's no less off-putting than people who write their own Harry Potter fan fiction, or whatever, like that, and become really annoying about any thing in pop culture where you're writing fan fiction and you're on all the Reddit board, subreddits about this thing, and you just become really passionate about it to the point that it no longer is fun to be around this person. So clearly we all seem to have that potential for that quality about something in us. Using one of my own interests. So if you go into my office, you'll see that I have a little picture frame with a blue outline with a red donut, and that is the red donut of Phish, the band, PHISH, and it's I've been a fan of this band since I was in high school, and it's one of these bands that is known for having an extremely cult-like following. I go on Phish Reddit sometimes, and every single show, even if people are not there, there's someone who posts the set list, and there are people who will ask you who do that, ask you how many times have you gone to a Phish show, and they'll be I've gone 700 times or whatever. Let us travel around the country with them like they did for the Grateful Dead. I in my life have been to maybe 15 of their concerts, which is way more than I've been to any other concert for any other band. But 15 in that universe is not even a drop in a bucket of the hardcore fans. So when people when I meet someone who does that, and they ask me how many shows have you been to, I always sort of say it almost apologetically, being I've been to a decent number. I've been to 15, but I know that's probably a lot less than you. On the other hand, it's sort of do you really need to go to 300 concerts of the same band over and over again? The answer some people would obviously have is, yeah, I do.
Or if you're a Facebook fan or a Yankee fan, you go to every game. I have a cousin who goes to every game.
Yeah, look, there's levels of all of it. I watch almost every Orioles game on television, mainly because I find it relaxing. It's not that I'm not doing other things, but it's interesting because on the one hand, and this kind of goes back to Aaron's comment of what I was saying, there is an element of saying well, people who are religious will often tell you that they're not really doing that for their own pleasure. They're doing it out of devotion to God. So it's I can have a really big meal and sing for hours, but the songs that I'm singing are all religious poetry. So really it's almost I'm praying for another 6 or 7 hours. So on the one hand, that is devotion. On the other hand, are you allowed to have enjoy the music. You know, there's like a famous like Shabbat piyut that is called Derori Kra, and you might have heard at some point, Sierra, in your boyfriends. I don't know if you've ever heard them sing it, but but there's a lot of different melodies for it. But one of them that I learned as a kid is to a Beach Boys song, to like a song called Sloop John B. Am I allowed to sing? Am I allowed to sing like am I allowed to sing this song to a Beach Boys song and still be praising God? Like, there's another song that I know that I can sing to the Bumblebee Tuna Fish jingle. Like, yum, yum, bumblebee, bumblebee, tuna. Like, I can sing it to that song. Does that count? Is that too pleasurable? I don't know. What I'm saying is, like, in this text, the question is it problematic? But I do think that, like, it's funny because at the time that this text is being written, I think it's reasonable to assume that people are not living in as much abundance of resources as we're living in today. And so the reason I like to teach about it in 2025 is that most of us are living in an abundance of resources where it is interesting to wonder, like, what could you live without? That's before you factor in, like, the poverty element of it all. Like, how much do you really need when there are people who, like, have so much less than you? Robin?
So, yeah, and thinking about how we're now living in this abundance of resources and, like, kind of an asceticism and this, like, I guess today there's this, I don't know, sort of interpretation of asceticism as, like, minimalism. Is there any, like, Jewish, like, so I mean, I ask specifically because there's, like, this debate in my household about, like, the amount of stuff that we should have, often, like, mostly related to, like, the number of books that we should have in our apartment. And so is there, I mean, so we kind of talked about, like, no pleasure, like, no life, but what about, like, stuff? Like, just, is that?
Yeah, I mean, stuff is a category of thing. Is a very interesting, there is a book called The Story of Stuff. I think there's also, like, a good YouTube video about it called The Story of Stuff. Because a lot of that is an environmental.
Right, and it's also.
Are you talking more like about minimalism, like of the Marie Kondo vibe, like the magical art of tidying up, kind of minimalism?
Like, if there's any sort of, like, Jewish, like, or rabbinic lore or advice about that, I guess, like, it's the amount of stuff, the level, like, the level of luxuriousness of your stuff. It says, upon the earth you shall sleep. So it's kind of, this is like, maybe you're on, like, a box spring, or, like, I don't know. It's.
The truth is, the funny thing is, I think it ebbs and flows. It ebbs and flows in Jewish tradition based on the level of wealth in the Jewish community at that time.
Yeah.
So meaning, like, on Yom Kippur, we read, pretty much every shul, I'm sure, probably reads this because it's such an iconic line. It's a haftarah from the prophet Isaiah. And there's a famous line in there that says, like, is this the fast I desire? All of you people have all this stuff. Is this the fast I desire that one day that you should just, like, decide to not eat and that's going to be, like, enough? No. The fast I desire is for you to give your money to people who don't have it, to break off the yoke of oppression. It's a super popular. Like, not every haftarah is so popular, but this one is, like, very popular because clearly Isaiah is kind of, like, saying to, like, this group of people with all of this plenty, like, you're not using this all that well. Amos, the prophet Amos is also like this. He is sort of like, but on the other hand, like, there are plenty of moments in Jewish history where it's clear that the Jews they're talking about are living in terrible poverty. And so, you know, like you don't really see that in like Jewish texts in like Europe prior to and during the Holocaust about like how dare you have so much stuff because all their stuff had been taken away. But there are like commentators who are like living in very wealthy Jewish societies who are really quite critical about that. But I think the truth though is that like our relationship to stuff I think has changed so much because it's so much easier to have
and acquire
stuff
and accumulate.
You know, like I don't know, you know, a lot of those things that we have in abundance in our homes were so limited even for wealthier people, I think hundreds of years ago. Like a book used to be so much more expensive to print today than it is. So I have lots of books in my home as well. And I have definitely reached the limit of bookshelves that my wife will allow me to have in the house. Almost all the books I buy now are electronic books. Do I buy too many of them? Possibly. But you know, they don't take up any space in my house. But they take up space in the cloud. They take up space in the cloud, and the cloud takes up a lot of space. You know, so you know, a wonderful example, like in Jewish tradition, is that like, you know, like people who keep kosher have separate dishes. Right now, there's no rule anywhere that says you need to have separate dishes.
We know meat.
Well, yes, but so 1,000 years ago, more likely the way that this was done was not that people had separate dishes, but it's that like basically they just wouldn't use a dish for a certain amount of time before they used it again with meat or milk. So like there are actually like Jewish houses you'll go to where you'll see people stick like silverware in like dirt, like a potted plant dirt, like they'll bury it for a day. And that is because maybe they mix up like a meat spoon and a milk spoon, and so they're not, you don't have to like throw the spoon away, you're supposed to like just wait. You can't use it for like basically like 24 hours, a little over 24 hours. The truth is that hundreds of years ago, there's no way that most of these people could afford to have 2 sets of everything in their house, or that they even had like that many pots and pans. Like think about how poor some of those Jewish communities must have been. So the rules had nothing to do with like having more than one. The reason why people have more than one today is because they can afford to have more than one. And so it's just easier to have 2 sets of dishes in your house. So you don't have to worry about, did this plate get used in the last 24 hours for meat versus milk. So our stuff.
The same thing with Passover, you know, you're supposed to have basic.
Sure, Passover is a whole other level, right? That stuff you shouldn't even be using, you know.
Any other time of the year.
Right, you know, now again, you know, but you could, because like basically, we talked about a mikvah, right? Like you can go to, you know, there are places in New York you can find this. Like you can go to places in New York around Passover, and you can basically take your dishes to be what in Yiddish they call it toiveld. But it's basically like immersed in water. It's basically like purified in the same way you go to the mikvah to be purified. Or you can rekasher them, which basically means you put it in like scalding hot water and you rekasher it. So you could do all those things with your Passover dishes and never replace them at all. Just that most people don't do that. Instead, they just buy a third set of dishes. You know, and that's true for most Jewish people of all levels of observance. So going back to Robin's question, like they do those things this way because they can afford to do it that way. You know, like there are lots of people who keep kosher who like have more than one dishwasher. because they don't believe that you can use meat and milk in the same dishwasher ever without having to clean it. So they can afford to have more than one dishwasher. I once ate dinner on Passover at a Chabad rabbi's house at somewhere in Canada. I'll say it honestly. They had a whole separate kitchen
Yep.
in their house that they only used on Passover. Now, the Chabad rabbi I knew growing up in college did not have that. He koshered his house for Passover, but this Chabad rabbi literally had a separate
Yes.
kitchen
Yes.
that just was used only for Passover. There's no way that 500 years ago that most people had the ability to do that. We are living in an era, to Robin's question, where stuff is a lot cheaper.
I would say even today, most people don't have, but you'd have to be pretty wealthy to have a separate kitchen that you use one time a year.
Yeah. So it's
Even if people were wealthy, like who would think? I mean, that's a very specific reason to have two kitchens.
I mean, this is where the lines of like pleasure and sacrifice become a little bit blurred, because my in-laws, may they live long and in good health, are fortunate enough to have a small condominium in Long Branch, New Jersey, just like a Jersey Shore town, right? Okay. Long Branch happens to be like super close to like one of the big Syrian Jewish communities in New Jersey. So if you drive like about 10 minutes away from their condo, which is like a 1-bedroom condo, it's basically got a living room, a little kitchen, 1 bedroom, and a bathroom, which is way more than most people can afford in their life to have this, but it's not like a palatial. But if you drive like 10 minutes away, you will see these enormous, most gorgeous synagogues I've ever seen, like in the world. Right by, not on the beach, but like right by the beach, with these like huge houses that are largely populated by, very religious Jewish people, mostly from Syria. And on the one hand, I think if you ask them, like, if you say, "Haven't you read this midrash? You're not supposed to have pleasure and like have a house by the ocean." And they would probably say, I mean, I give a lot of my money to tzedakah, and I have enough money to buy this house, but I also have enough money to like help build this beautiful synagogue. I'm giving my money to God. Like, there's no clear dividing line on it. Works.
Like, I was gonna say that looking like parts of Brooklyn, like Midwood, for example, like there's gorgeous houses that people have built, in the religious area, or Ball Park, Brooklyn, or some of the nice areas of Brooklyn.
Yeah. Now again, it's not by any means the majority of any of that of those communities in particular. But the point I'm making about it is sort of like this dividing line of like, are you supposed to enjoy anything? It's actually not. It's really kind of strange and unclear. But I think it's something that we should all like sit with a little more, because per Robin's comment, we are living in a moment, certainly where things that were at one point in time very, very expensive to even get once are really, really, really cheap. And plenty of us have access to that at various stages of the income spectrum. So while not to shame any of us, right, like it raises the question of like, what could we do without? What could we do without? maybe we don't have to actually like go to this level of it and say, well, I should just go without everything. But the question of like, what can you live without is a real interesting and important thing to grapple with, especially in a time period where we have so much relative to what we had in the past. Any final thoughts? Okay. Well, we made it to 11:30 and no one else is here. But I'm glad that I got to spend all this time with all of you. I'm going to go run to the restroom. People can hang around as long as they like or go, or they can come in my office and sit where there's air conditioning and a fan, or you can go. I want to make sure I stay until a little after noon in case anyone happens to show up 15 minutes ahead. But it's so wonderful to see all of you, and Mazel Tov in advance to Sierra. We will, by this time tomorrow, we'll be a member of the Jewish people. So, yeah. So, quiz bowl got in the way of our earlier date. Yeah.
I have a couple quiz bowl this next school year. I'm not mad at that.
I did quiz bowl in middle school. I got nothing wrong.
I'm scared.
Alright.
I was gonna say,
Huh?
You like it?
first thing,